All right, welcome back to our conversations about our textbook. And the era that we're about to go into now is referred to as the Great Depression. So this is a term that is rather unusual. The press had approached President Hoover in 1929 and asked him if they were entering into a new Great Panic, which was a reference to the late 1890s, which had 4 years of depression following a crash. And Hoover, trying to keep the media on his side, basically asked them not to use the panic word, but to think about it more of as a Great Depression. And FDR is going to inherit an unprecedented economic crisis. There would be more people struggling and suffering. There was more people going hungry every day, so the president has a rather difficult issue in his hands. So Congress tries to help after the crash, as does Hoover. It's referred to as Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And it was meant to keep banks, life insurance companies, and railroads and other big businesses in afloat. And with that came the Glass-Steagall Act of 1932, which would increase the availability of commercial loans. By this time, farmers were starting to see their properties being foreclosed on by states and local banks, and rather than appeal to the legal process for leniency, the farmers formed their own sort of vigilante groups that went out and intervened when banks tried to foreclose on properties. Veterans groups formed what was called the Bonus Expeditionary Force, made up of World War I soldiers who had been promised a cash bonus by the Congress. Now, that promise was meant to be paid when these veterans reached the age of 65, which was going to be in the 1940s, at the earliest, the 1940s. And these soldiers wanted their bonuses paid early. And so this led to a number of Hoovervilles, which were sort of like encampments in Washington, D.C., and protests being done against Congress. And the president, in the summer of 1932, ordered the army to go in and break up these camps. And when the ensuing riot resulted in the death of an infant. And this was basically the end for Hoover's attempt to become president of the United States. Hoover was given the nomination in 1932, but it's very clear in the preliminary runnings there that the Republicans were feeling rather deflated. And so statistically, Republicans stayed at home in pretty large numbers. But the bonus armies issue, in a sense, really was the nail in the coffin for Hoover, and the election results, as you can see here on the slide, is rather dramatic, 472 to 59. And so in the 1933 inauguration, FDR promised a new deal for the American people and told them that the only thing they had to fear was fear itself. And this becomes a major line in American history. And so Roosevelt's going to follow, like his cousin Teddy Roosevelt and his hero Woodrow Wilson, and promise everyone the 3 R's. He would bring relief to the immediate problems of the Depression. He would help the economy to recover. And then he promised to reform the system so that these sorts of dramatic crises would no longer happen. Now, some people refer to this idea of socialism being used to save capitalism, and in reality, the theory behind the New Deal, something that's going to be called Keynesian economics, was really part of a larger liberal economic school that had been developing around the country. A sort of colleague of his will have discussions in a different angle, as we'll see later in the year. But the idea here was that the country was going to try to find a way to stimulate the private sector And so the problem for FDR's programs is that there really weren't many efforts to try to stimulate the private sector to go up. And so when you follow Keynesian economics, the idea in theory is that the government endeavors to take on a large amount of borrowing in order to involve itself in major public works projects, and at the same time to lower interest rates to encourage borrowing and hopefully allow the private sector to kind of invest and take advantage of low prices to increase market share and to go into new ventures. But FDR really doesn't do that part of it, nor does he control his budget. And so in reality, you're going to get more of a stagnation. And so the economy becomes almost entirely dependent on government spending. And this is a major problem. In fact, he increases taxes significantly on the rich, more as a symbolic thing than anything else. But he brings on board a group of PhDs from the various Ivy League schools in the area, what's a group of thinkers and speechwriters that'll be labeled by the media as the Brain Trust. And so they're really going to be experimenting with a great deal of new thinking, right? And so the monetary system was seen as the immediate problem. People's faith in the banking system and the value of the dollar itself was really at a low tide. And so Roosevelt supported strengthening this system by beginning with the Emergency Banking Relief Act. And this actually closed all the banks for 4 days, what the president euphemistically called a banking holiday. And so the banks were going to be reviewed by government auditors. And essentially there were going to be 3 categories, and there are probably more, but essentially there were 3. There were the banks that were completely solvent. They could open up tomorrow and there were really going to be no problems. There were other banks that were essentially okay. Their books were fine, but there was a shortfall and some mismanagement issues. They could reopen, but they were going to be opened under federal government receivership, kind of like a shadow over these organizations to help them bring back to balance. And then, of course, the worst of the 3 were those that were not solvent, whose assets then had to be taken over by the government and then sold off to other banks. And so with this comes another Glass-Steagall Act, 1933, which gives us something called the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This is a new set of rules that was meant to keep banks from commingling their funds when engaging in either investment banking or retail banking. So essentially, Glass-Steagall made banks break up. They could either engage in commercial banking or retail banking, but they couldn't use the funds and commingle them. They couldn't use funds from one and then the other. And so this created 2 entirely separate organizations, even within one banking system. So it was going to require 2 sets of audits, 2 sets of cash flows, 2 sets of requirements, and it was meant to keep these funds separate from each other. It then required banks to have at least 30% of their deposits on reserve at any given time. And it also required banks to participate in an insurance program that would cover everyone's deposits, at the time up to $5,000 worth of principal. But today, I believe it's something like $150,000 or $200,000. I can't remember the exact amount because I never have that amount. But this still today, if you listen to banking commercials or see their ads in print, you'll see that where it says member FDIC, and that's to allow people to understand that your money is going to be guaranteed, at least your principal, if not your interest. the Securities and Exchange Commission also gets started, and it is meant to put a watchdog over Wall Street and to end practices such as insider trading, and it was supposed to stop things like Ponzi schemes that was started in the 1920s. But it was really meant to bring order and control over the speculative nature of Wall Street, and to help keep speculation and market bubbles to a minimum. And then, as I had stated earlier, FDR thought he was going to be able to control the budget, but it really doesn't come anywhere near that. And so for relief measures, there's going to be the FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Act, and it's meant to create an agency that was supposed to basically provide funding to allow states and other private endeavors to basically finance projects at the state and local level, and to give monies to the private sector in order to engage in economic activity. With this came something called the Civilian Conservation Corps. This is rather unique and odd in my opinion, but essentially it targeted 18 to 25-year-old single men. It was meant to be jobs for unmarried males. They were going to plant free trees and do assorted construction projects. You can see these projects all over the United States, actually. In San Diego, California, where I am located, you can go to an area called Old Town, and that almost that entire thing was done by CCC workers and the WPA, which were New Deal projects. If you go into Cuyamaca State Park or into Balboa Park, there are these trails all over the place and staircases on the trails going up mountains. These were all done by CCC workers. What's unusual about it is they were kept in worker camps, and they were basically fed, clothed, and housed, and they had to ask for leave if they wanted to go away for a weekend or something like that. And most of their money went to their families. They were given an allowance. It was just an unusual sort of thing for a free market system, but people voluntarily joined these programs in order to get to work. It's also, I think, important to say that 18 to 25-year-olds, when they're unemployed and have nothing to do, they tend not to just sit at home and do nothing. They tend to get together with other 18 to 25-year-olds and get into trouble. So the National Industrial Recovery Act, which created the NRA, was meant to create these massive programs for recovery. This program was going to be struck down, or was struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional because they believed it was violating separate but equal nature of the balance of powers in the government. So this is a picture of your CCC guys out there working, and so agricultural assistance was seen as vital. For most of us today, agriculture seems like such a non-entity because it's literally 1% of the workforce involved in this area. But for a lot of our history, and even really up till today, there was a strategic element to agriculture. And what I mean by that was there was a sentiment among Americans, and really anybody who's a national of any country, that your ability to feed yourself was a really important part of sovereignty. That if you were dependent on other countries for food, then you were in a sense vulnerable in terms of your very sovereignty. And so this was the issue here. So if you had heard my earlier podcast on the McNary-Haugen bill, which had been passed twice during the Coolidge administration. This gets revived in what's going to be called the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933. And it was meant to create scarcity. And what this meant was that the government was supposed to come into the market and buy surplus products at the higher level, which people called parity. And they would then sell that surplus at whatever price they could get. So instead of the farmer eating the loss on commodity prices, the government would. So it's a form of subsidization. And with that came a later policy, which was to pay farmers not to grow anything. Now, the first Adjustment Act gets stricken down because it allowed the president to determine what the fines would be. And the court believed that that was a violation of separation of powers. And the second Agricultural Adjustment Act simply got rid of the penalty tax. And so this began what we still do in the United States, which is basically subsidizing farmers. What was really just, quite honestly, in my opinion, somewhat obscene and unthinkable is that in order to create scarcity initially, the government went in and actually slaughtered just hundreds of thousands of farm animals and tilled underground acres and acres of perfectly good food in order to maintain in order to maintain a certain price level. And this was done while there were people starving. I mean, this is just really an unbelievable thing to see happening in the United States. So in order to revive industrial growth, they decided to do what is very popular in socialist countries still today, and that is to shorten the work week and shorten the workday. So what we now think of as a standard, which is an 8-hour workday and a 40-hour work week, was actually done initially in order to encourage companies to hire more workers. So if you work someone more than 8 hours or more than 40 hours a week, you had to pay them overtime. And this was meant as an incentive. But the fact is that, you're not really going to incentivize things because unless the market is really viable for a private company, even short-term positive gains are going to be seen with suspicion. And so it becomes more feasible to pay the overtime than it is to take on more headcount because nobody wants to fire people. And so, it's interesting idea, but it just doesn't always work. So in order for unions to organize, they had to actually get permission in order to do so. And this was meant to try to keep pricing down. Now, the benefit was if you were a private company, but you were selling products and services to government projects that were happening literally all across the country, well, then you were basically having a really positive situation because you had government guaranteed demand. The government came to you and said, hey, we want, 400,000 meters of steel rail. Well, guess what? They were going to buy that rail and they were going to buy it at the price you wanted. And so this becomes a rather, it brings up kind of an interesting issue. And so it's just somewhat unusual. But, it's kind of like the two sides of the coin, if you will. On one side, you would like to be sort of left alone and allowed to run your business. But then on the other side of that coin is the kind of lure and attraction that comes from knowing that you had a customer with essentially unlimited resources. So now the idea that that the Depression basically was at its worst in 1933 is in fact true, but there was continuing hardship for many Americans, and this cannot be overstated. right? People were losing their homes, their cars. Families were in a great deal of distress. Divorce rates went way up, right? Women had a particular burden. Men were abandoning families in very large numbers, becoming what they called hobos. They would just basically ride the rails, going back and forth to different places, trying to scrounge money. And a number of women found themselves not only in a very stressful place as far as financial was concerned, but it was very difficult to find work because most companies wanted to hire married men first because they were seen as the breadwinners of their families. And so this became really difficult. So we get to now, what happened is a lot of the progress that we had seen in child labor laws since the Gilded Age and into the Progressive Era now kind of go backwards. A lot of kids are going to drop out of school in order to help their families and supplement their income. And so these social ills get compounded by a decade-long drought in the 1930s that was spawned a human and environmental catastrophe known as the Dust Bowl. It affected the Great Plains region of the United States, encompassing Colorado, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska, and tilled land left by farmers who could not afford to plant, coupled with the drought and high winds of the region, resulted in what were called black blizzards or blackouts and dust storms. And by 1938, 25 million acres of prime farmland had lost most of its topsoil. Farmers in this area would migrate to find jobs in the cities, but rarely found those jobs. It's the subject of a famous novel called The Grapes of Wrath, which was also made into a film with Henry Fonda. And so the drought and soil erosion brought on a great migration. The most numerous were people from Oklahoma and Arkansas called Okies and Arkies. Here in California, a large number of these people came here looking for work, only to find that that really wasn't the truth. Many of them will go back after the Depression ends, but many stay. And in again here in San Diego, in an area referred to as East County, there are still a lot of remnants of that culture. There are rodeos here. There's country western music is very popular here in Southern California, and so this really ties itself back to this period of time. So regionally, these were big issues. In the Tennessee River Valley, perpetual flooding and a lack of electricity was creating a 1-2 punch to the economies there. So when the Depression hit, the already very poor areas of the Tennessee River Valley, which included a place called Appalachia, it was doubly cruel. So annual flooding would literally carry away these already poorly constructed shacks and hovels along the riverbanks. So a series of dams are going to be constructed starting in Muscle Shoals, and is going to lead to a government program called the Tennessee Valley Authority. And this still exists as a federal agency, but it basically created these series of dams in order to control the flooding in the entire region and also generate hydroelectric power to those areas that still had not seen electrification. And so in the Pacific Northwest, we have a similar series of issues. And again, more dams are going to be built here. So it's meant to control a regional issue with flooding and water control and energy. But it was also going to provide tens of thousands of jobs, at least temporarily, for people on these massive construction projects that take place. So socially, minorities in the New Deal really is somewhat of a misnomer. African Americans were usually the last people to receive assistance in the New Deal. They were the last to be hired in most scenarios. And yet many African Americans are going to see the New Deal as a chance to gain more economic agency and status in America. And so now, this did not stop, right, everything that African Americans were suffering. And so when we see the NAACP activities in that period, African Americans were going to gain some legal victories in the Supreme Court concerning civil rights. Although they would not be all-encompassing, they would set the foundation for future legislation that would come in the 1950s and 60s. The young man is in the middle here is Hayward Patterson, one of the defendants in a major case in Decatur, Alabama. Indians, right now. Indians had only been given a chance to become citizens in 1924. And so what happens in the New Deal is something called the Indian Reorganization Act. Now, if you can remember back to Chapter 18, there was an attempt to, quote-unquote, reform Indian policy, called the Dawes Severalty Act. And that basically broke the tribes up into 160-acre plots that were given to individual Indian families. And it was a disaster right up from the beginning. And there was just unthinkable amounts of abuse. And so there weren't really funds to do all that much for Indians, nor was there a great deal of desire to do so. And so the Indian Reorganization Act allowed tribal groups to reorganize themselves in a communal sense, right? They could recreate their tribes and reservations and what have you, and pool their monies. Many Indians rejected it because they felt that this was the federal government trying to shirk its responsibilities from treaties that had been signed over 100 years ago, where there was money promised to these tribes. But also because many felt that FDR was just trying to create these little tourist museums where these, Indian tribes would just provide sort of a form of entertainment for travelers. So there are a number of court decisions that come out here, and basically I want to address them in the sense that what they're doing here is they're trying to expand what we refer to as legal status and agency for African Americans. It's really critical, and again, like I said earlier, it's laying down the groundwork for future civil rights legislation that's going to come in the next couple of decades, really. So Eleanor Roosevelt, who is the first lady, provided the president with the sort of the ears, eyes, and legs, literally, of the President of the United States. And she redefined the role of the First Lady. She took a prominent role in American public through regularly syndicated newspaper articles and press conferences and promoting labor and women's rights. In many areas, she advocated issues that her husband didn't dare to challenge, and because he would lose support, mostly of Southern Democrats. And there were, however, critics of the New Deal. It wasn't necessarily easy riding, right? So, and many of the critics came from the left, right? So when it became apparent that the New Deal wasn't completely able to defeat the Depression, criticism of FDR plan began to emerge, right? Many people, such as Huey Long, senator from Louisiana, sought the limelight to attack FDR with their own plans. He had what was called the every man a king policy, where he said that the government was wasting all this money. It might as well just issue every American a check for $5,000, which at the time would have been considered an upper middle class annual salary. And so, known as the Kingfish, right? Long's Share of the Wealth program advocated stealing from the rich to give to the poor. He's actually going to be assassinated in the, I believe, the Capitol building in Louisiana, a gunshot. Dr. Francis Townsend promoted a plan to pay $200 a month to every citizen over the age of 60. The plan itself would have cost more than half the nation's income and help only 9% of the population. But this was the precursor to what's going to be called the Social Security program. And then Father Francis Coughlin, known as the radio priest, used his show to call for a return to the unlimited coinage of silver from the populist era of the late 1890s. And it was in an attempt to increase the monetary system, right? He was an intelligent guy, but he was also very racist, very, anti-Semitic person. Now, Andrew Mellon is also a critic. He was the former Secretary of Treasury under Coolidge. And he comes out and openly criticizes FDR and the New Deal because the numbers were not working out. They just did not add out correctly. And he was actually correct, as we have now more recently evaluated. He was being very truthful. The numbers were exploding the debt with very little in return in terms of numbers of people actually putting back to work. And the main issue was that when the government engaged in a public works project, it was great. But once that project ended, there wasn't anything in the private sector for those workers to transition to. And so the government felt compelled to engage in yet another public works project in order to keep people employed. Well, that's wonderful in the short term, but until the private sector was given the space to stimulate itself and to get moving, then this was really just money thrown into the burner and disappearing essentially. FDR goes after Mellon viciously. He's going to have the Internal Revenue Service audit him, I believe, 4 separate times, 4 years in a row. And I believe the first time they audited him, they ended up owing Mellon more money than he actually had paid. He was really targeted bad, not just by the FDR administration, but by the media that was very enamored by him. And this is unusual because at the time, Mellon was negotiating a gift to the American people. He and his wife donated their entire art collection, which is now the foundational collection of the East Wing of the National Art Gallery, which, and in fact, he will provide the funding for the building for it because the government said it didn't have the money for it. So it's somewhat interesting and leads into this conversation about the arts. So what the government did as part of the WPA is that they had an arts program where they would basically pay writers and painters and sculptors to go out and do major works, right? And this included radio programs. This included research into different parts of American history. There's actually a quite valuable set of audio recordings that WPA artists and social scientists did, where they were basically paid to go and do interviews of former slaves, which is just an invaluable set of information for us as Americans. Radio was still the main source of entertainment and information. FDR is going to master this in what were referred to as the fireside chats. And yet now is the time of what we call the silver screen, the sort of golden days of the movie industry. About 60 million people go to the movies every month in America, and that's just unbelievable. And in fact, a lot of movie theaters in larger cities actually ran on a continuous reel all day into the night. and Americans were basically obsessed with it. And so some of these great stars from the period were making monies that the average American could only dream of making. It was really an unbelievable amount of money. But many of these artists were under what they called contracts. So some of the great stars that you think of, like Clark Gable or Judy Garland or, Fred Astaire or any of these people, they were actually contracted with major movie studios. And so they would just be constantly, they were like an employee. And so they made all of these movies because essentially they didn't have a choice as to whether they did a film or not. They were under contract, and so they did the movie. And studios would negotiate with each other about lending each other talent in order to do various larger projects. So in the painting, which is this Rivera over here doing these major murals, these were paintings that were commissioned by the federal government for major buildings that were being done in all of these large government projects all over the country. And so modern dance, Martha Graham is going to be during this period, Alvin Ailey, but of course tap and jitterbug are kind of like the more popular dances that are out there. But the underlying theme of art and entertainment at the time was escapism. All you had to do was look at the Marx Brothers movies of the time period, and you'd know exactly what I'm talking about. These were films, these were Broadway shows that were meant to let people take their troubles off their shoulders and to just forget their suffering for just a little while. And what happened was that many of these were federal projects. These were monies or just downright programs run by the federal government in order to keep writers and artists working with their craft. Now, the theory behind it, by the way, was that if the government didn't do this, many writers and artists and performers would have to, in a sense, give up their art and instead go and do whatever they could in order to earn money. And the theory was that this art then would be lost to all of us, that we would all, in a sense, pay as a society and as a community for not allowing these people to continue to do their creative side of their lives. And so the rationale was, by the government stepping in and doing this, these artists would be able to continue with their work rather than to abandon it. So in the old court, which they mean by the Supreme Court at the time, which is really a somewhat conservative court that had been appointed by the old guard Republicans of the 1920s, initially resisted the New Deal. Most of the justices on the Supreme Court in the early 1930s followed something called strict construction. And this was that when it came to allowing the expansion of federal power, only Article 1, Section 8 could be applicable, because in that are listed the enumerated or expressed powers of the federal government. All the other powers, according to strict construction, were reserved powers for the states, as articulated in the 10th Amendment. And this came into direct conflict with FDR's idea of federal activism. FDR believed that because the government was confronted with a massive economic disaster, that federal power had to be increased, even if it was just temporarily, in order to accommodate the government's work in this area. And so what happens is the court strikes down a number of federal programs, and the separation of powers came in the Schechter poultry case, or the sick chicken case, where the court said, look, you can't do this. And so that AAA was gotten rid of. And then what constitutes interstate trade comes out in United States v. Butler. And then FDR ends up losing 7 Supreme Court cases in a row, all of them dealing with New Deal programs. And going into the 1936 election, Roosevelt made sure that the American people understood that that the old guard Republican thinkers and big corporate giants were the only thing sort of holding him back. And so he is reelected in 1936 by just an unbelievable margins. His opponent, Alf Landon of Kansas, only gets 8 electoral votes. I mean, that's unbelievable. And so FDR's second term, or what's sometimes referred to as the Second New Deal, really started in 1933. And this landslide victory of his in the period led to all this huge list, as you can see here, of events that take place. Now, the Wagner Act is known by labor unions as one of the most major pieces of legislation of their existence. This established the idea of an 8-hour workday, a 40-hour work week. It made collective bargaining a federally protected legal act. And so the Social Security Act gets passed in 1935. This is probably the most well-known and popular pieces of legislation. This created a payment to anybody over the age of 65. It had to be spent in that month. It was meant to encourage older workers to retire. Many of them had lost all of their savings in the crashes of 1933, which were some of the bank failures that happened. And so they did not have the income to stop working. So this was meant to encourage many of them to stop working. And so it becomes very popular. Now, this created a problem because FDR was increasing taxes, particularly on the wealthy, beyond 70%. And so critics started to talk about soaking the rich, which is a line that we still hear used today, particularly against Democrats. And other people refer to it as the Robin Hood theory, which is to, take from the rich and give to the poor. And the thing is, though, the Social Security Act was actually a payroll tax. That still is this case. It's a pay-as-you-go system where the current workers pay a tax that finances the retirement for people over 65. And what happens is that the act passes in 35 and the taxes start being collected in 36. And that tax took $2 billion out of the economy. And it contributed to a recession in 1937 that Republicans will very quickly label the Roosevelt recession. And so there's a reason why the New Deal is seen as ending in 1939. Because in the idea here of politics, the recession of 37 led to a setback for the president in the midterm elections of 1938. And in that election, both Republicans and conservative Democrats, what some people refer to as blue dog or just old Democrats, gained a majority in the House and Senate. Now, Democrats, if you simply counted D's and R's, Democrats still held a majority. But when Republicans and conservative Democrats formed a coalition, they formed what was referred to as an anti-New Deal majority. And so opposition within the Democratic Party actually contributed to waning support for the New Deal. And it's also very true, and this is something that people don't really know, unemployment never ever went below 15%. Now, if you think about this, in this recent recession that we call the Great Recession, right, unemployment went to about 10%, and people felt like it was just horrible. This was 15%, and that was considered the best the government could do. And so a lot of Americans had simply lost respect or hope, if it were, in that program. So if you notice the statistics of the time period, and this is from some of the newest literature that's out there, particularly Amity Schlei's Forgotten Man, or there's a piece by a gentleman, his name's not in my head right now, called New Deal, Raw Deal. And they look at these numbers, and just for the amount of money that the government was borrowing and spending, it was a really bad return for that investment in terms of employment numbers. But if you were one of the 25% of Americans unemployed in 1933, 15% sounded really awesome. So the midterms elections then led to an anti-New Deal. And so some people refer to the New Deal as a halfway revolution. A lot of Americans at the time were embracing Marxism and socialism, and were hoping that the New Deal would spark a true revolution away from liberal economics. And that, of course, didn't really do that. So this is where we get this using socialism to save capitalism. But what really ended up ending the war, ending the Depression, was war in Europe. So in 1939, Germany is going to invade Poland, and Germany will go to war with the rest of the Allies, namely Britain and France. And the United States is going to undergo, I guess I would call it a pre-war mobilization effort. People called it a defensive program, but it was a little bit of a government buildup, and about 2 million men will be recruited into the army as a quote-unquote precaution against attack. And this is going to begin a major stimulus program that's really going to end the Depression for most Americans. But the truly radical thing here is this new understanding of the role and power of federal government. Americans now were going to expect, not just hope for or ask for help from their government, they were going to expect the government in huge crises to step in and be active in bringing about relief to American suffering and to recover the economies. So this concludes our conversation on the Depression. So hope everybody's doing well, and we'll talk to you soon.